Sultan Osman looked out of his imperial tent as a freezing winter breeze hit his face, and he looked at the Janissaries, talking and drinking coffee and laughing. For a whole month they had been sitting looking at the walls of Khotyn. For a month their attacks proved to be ineffective against the Polish defenses, and now the winter was setting in. Hardly the glorious campaign Osman had planned. "It is all their fault," he whispered to himself. The Janissaries throughout the campaign had let him down. They underperformed and disobeyed his orders. That was the only reason he was yet to win a spectacular victory. "A peasant can wield a gun better than a Janissary," he whispered again to himself. If the Janissaries weren't going to fight for him, fine, so be it. He was going to get his own army then. Welcome to our second video on our series about Sultan Osman II. Before we get to the video, please subscribe. We are close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, which will allow us to monetize our content. Enjoy! The mighty Ottoman Empire was now ready to march on Poland, but before setting out, Osman wanted to settle yet another problem. A sultan needed an heir to secure his position, and thus a wife. Before setting out, he made his first marriage with a former slave, Ayşe Sultan. Now that a marriage was secure, everything was ready to march to war, right? Well, no. Osman wanted to count the whole army by himself. He had no trust in Janissary officers, and ghost soldiers was a chronic problem of the army at the time. Janissary officers would simply inflate the number of troops they had in their regiments and collect paychecks for soldiers that did not exist. So Sultan Osman stood there and made every single soldier march before him, one by one. This took 3 days. For 3 days, the soldiers marched one by one before Osman. At the end, Osman got nothing but 3 wasted days and a frustrated army, whom he had clearly shown distrust. On top of that, here the Sultan also announced cuts in salaries of the clergy. By this point, it was clear to everyone that Osman had taken a position against the imams of the empire. The young Sultan also insisted to oversee every small detail of the army. He personally administrated the construction of bridges and camps, which normally would be a job for lesser officers. Osman probably thought himself as a hardworking sultan who was down to do anything, but he actually was hindering his army's efforts by trying to micromanage. It took the Ottoman army 5 months to get to the Polish border. The army had set out of Constantinople in April of 1621, and they had reached the front line in September of that year. This was an astronomical amount of time. This meant that even if there was no enemy to resist Osman, he had a month to occupy Poland before the winter set in, and his army would have to return. Osman halved the bonuses of Janissaries. Normally, Janissaries would receive bonuses for captured enemy commanders or for their individual prowess in the battlefield. Osman decided that the Janissaries were already overpaid and cut their bonuses by half. The Polish-Lithuanian army had not been sitting idle in those 5 months. 50,000 Polish-Lithuanian troops crossed the border and occupied the fortress of Khotyn. This fortress blocked the Ottoman path into Poland. They had prepared defenses there. Ottoman army surrounded the southern part of the fortress, and they had no time to lose. The drums were sounded, and the Ottoman troops rushed to the walls. Their first attack almost succeeded. The first defense line of the Polish-Lithuanian army was overrun. The enemy was on the back foot. Now it was the time for the elite Janissaries to push their advantage. But they decided not to. Instead, they started looting the Polish camp. This killed their momentum and gave enough time for the Polish army to counterattack. At the end, the Ottoman army was repelled. Second attack also failed due to commander infighting. The Ottoman left wing managed to make advances, However, the main commander, the Grand Vizier, refused to send reinforcements there to press the attack. The Grand Vizier was worried that in case of a victory, the commander of the left wing would replace him as a war hero. Thus, another opportunity was wasted and the Ottoman attack was repelled. The next day, Janissaries simply refused to fight. They had very little love for the young Sultan who had disrespected them and cut their wages. And the fortress of Khotyn was not a walk in the park, but a meat grinder. They definitely were not going to sacrifice their lives for Sultan Osman. And Sultan Osman did not take their disobedience easy and escalated the situation further. He ordered the arrest of 100 Janissary officers and had them executed publicly. Seeing the bodies of hanged commanders made the Janissaries only more determined and angry. They were not going to fight. Osman likely went to his tent that night and cried with frustration. His army would not fight. His commanders would rather fight each other rather than the enemy. The winter was setting in. Soon, the whole area would be under deep snow. And lastly, his supplies were drying up. His army would soon not have any food left to eat or any bullets to shoot. Now, as desperate as Osman's situation may sound, the Polish-Lithuanian situation was no better. The Polish army had lost half its fighting force. The Cossack hetman, Petro Sahaidaishny, was heavily wounded and would die of his wounds afterwards. The main commander, Jan Karol, died of illness. On top of it all, meanwhile the Polish army was stuck in the fortress. Crimean horde was ransacking Poland. There was no one left to defend the country against Tatar raiders who went on to devastate Poland and took thousands of slaves. The Commonwealth needed a peace almost as bad as Osman. So on October 9th, Treaty of Khotyn was signed. Osman's plans of grand conquest and a Baltic base was buried in the snow of Khotyn. But the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth agreed to leave the fortress to the Ottomans and not interfere in Moldova. So, a white peace at the end, with neither side gaining anything but casualties. It is likely that Osman thought long and hard about his next move that night. His grand plans were buried deep, that was for sure. But he had now more urgent worries. It is likely that another goal of this campaign was to secure his throne with a victory, but now he had the opposite result. He had seen firsthand that his soldiers would not fight for him, and he knew that he had upset the clergy. And now that the war was lost, the common people who had been suffering due to the Little Ice Age and its consequences would also turn against him. But maybe not everything was so bleak. That day, he received a messenger from Constantinople just after the battle, from his wife, Ayşe Sultan. His wife congratulated him on the birth of a son, Prince Ömer. Sultan Osman's heart was once again filled with hope. He was going to get rid of everything that stopped him in Khotyn. He was going to get rid of the Janissaries. He was going to get rid of the clergy and the bureaucracy, even if that meant hanging every single one of them. He was going to get rid of the palace customs, and now he had a son to replace him. Osman once again, after so much time, felt like the most powerful man on the earth. I am the Sultan of 3 continents, he told to himself. He was not going to be stopped by his subjects. The next day, Osman declared that Khotyn was in fact not a humiliating defeat, but a rare species of victory. The fortress was liberated, and the Polish army expelled from Ottoman Empire's borders. All provinces were ordered to celebrate Sultan Osman's great victory at Khotyn. Yet Osman was fooling no one but himself. Thank you for watching our second episode on Sultan Osman II of the Ottoman Empire. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. Leave a comment if you disagree with any part of the video or would like to leave any additional opinions or information you have. Lastly, please subscribe, and we will see you in the next episode.